Before we start the questions and discussion, I've got one or two plugs to make. The first is for the Declaration Disco at East End Park on the 10th of April. £7 for adults, £5 for children. Tickets from Maggie or Glenn at the back of the hall there. This is going to be another of these cracking evenings with all kinds of things happening. So get your tickets from the shop or directly from Maggie this evening. And the other thing is that the Yes Kelty organisation has been producing a magazine called The Grist, and there are two issues of it have come out. One was the winter of last year, and then this one, the Scissors On, is the spring of this year. And there are some cracking articles in both of these issues, and they are free to pick up. And so I'll put them at the exit on the table, and you can pick up, well, until the copies are exhausted. There's only about half a dozen left. You're welcome to collect a free copy of that.
There's some in the iPod as well.
And there's some, right, thanks. There's some in the iPod also. Right, we're quarter to 9 or so, and we're now going to have questions from you. I hope you've been thinking of questions. There have been so many interesting points raised, and discussion of any issues that you think should be raised at this time about how we go forward. Anything that Lesley or Jonathan or Willie or Grant has said, please feel free to ask. So over to you. Right, gentlemen there.
Surely if Scotland does eventually get independence, and not just for Scotland alone, I'm talking about every major city in the UK, surely they should have their own stock exchange. You should never have done away with the Scottish exchanges in Scotland. There used to be two Scottish stock exchanges. Now everything's controlled from London. And it's like the home of the UK is getting control for London, so surely that's one thing we should be trying to get, is at least one or two stock exchanges back in Scotland again.
And we've got a view on the viability of a Scottish stock exchange.
Massively, actually. Anybody?
I just think that, in some ways, the inequality that we see, and the way that the kind of economy is structured, so that all the resource and the value that's put into it is sucked up, away from the people that are creating it. I think the stock market is just part of that. So I think instead of worrying about where the stock market's here, I think we've got to start worrying about how we change the political economy so that the resources and value and power are redistributed across it.
Yeah.
So let's start with that, and then we can see where it goes.
But you're going to need a stock market to encourage young businesses to start up in the first place.
There's other ways to invest in businesses. I mean, one of the pieces of work we did was on the Scottish Investment Bank. So to look at a bank that is supported by the state that can invest in small businesses. I mean, I think Lesley spoke about the German model of this country's not really had an industrial strategy for the last 30, 40 years. It's just kind of been left to the market. And the rise of the big banks is part of that problem. In Germany, where they have like lots more small and medium-sized businesses that are really high value, call it the Mittelstand, I think it's called. And they're all funded by local banks, so the local authorities own the banks and actually are able to resource those sort of businesses. So I think, looking at the London Stock Exchange is part of the economy that is not benefiting the productive economy, I don't think, in huge amounts of ways.
Just to come in on a wee thought on that. I mean, my husband, if any of you listen to the podcast we do, Chris and I, if you don't and you fancy more of this nonsense, there's a podcast that every Sunday night for people to listen to on their way to work on Monday. But he's very keen to set up community banks, plural, because there's money in this room. There's money in accounts. which people could be putting towards useful things that are not being currently done in Dunfermline because people won't lend.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the group that might be first to take this up might be people in Portobello, where they've got a lot of problems of the windows, the old-fashioned single-glazed windows, begin to kind of fall to pieces, and yet, of course, they're protected by historic status, so they're kind of expensive to repair and to get double-glazed. So the idea would be, instead of everyone tackling that problem themselves and finding it perhaps hard to get the money, perhaps it would be possible to get a job lot of them done, which might then actually employ somebody to produce sash windows in Portobello. And actually, they're not the only people who need to replace them. They're all 100 years old. This room. So then, who would lend to that? Well, maybe not any of the banks, despite all the money, our money they're spending telling us that they'll lend to small businesses, which they then don't. Perhaps the community could actually set up a community bank to pay for that improvement. So, you know, to me, I'm quite interested in a lot of the voluntarism that has been quite normal in Nordic countries, in Germany. In fact, all over the blooming place. There's been such a belief in Scotland that the state will finally come to the rescue, partly because of the vast degree to which we have come out of council housing. So people keep waiting for the cavalry, and the cavalry looks like the councils. But actually, in most other successful democracies, you've got a mixture of providers, and you have far more cooperatives, far more powerful credit unions, far more local activity where money is held within the community and doesn't leach away in any way whatsoever. So I'd be very interested, far before I worried about, you know, where the stock exchange was based, would be keeping money in communities to then take on ambitious projects of renewal. Because the other problem for a lot of credit unions in some places is they haven't got enough projects to put the money into, unbelievably. So to me, this is all first.
I say lots about publicly funded companies, but I don't know if that's really the discussion that we want to have at the moment.
Well, I think you've covered the substance of the question. Basically, that there are perhaps better alternative ways of financing projects than going down the model of stocks and shares and stock exchanges, which are closer to gambling dens than really helping the economy and helping people to do things.
I was just raising the point that all the bankers are, if you like, all through the stock exchanges in London, and what you actually need to do is you need the bankers to get working. I know the scandal with the banks, but actually we need to deal with banks, and we need the bankers to invest the money locally, which I think we all want.
Right, I think
we'll have to agree to disagree that that's the main way to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many of you are Radio Scotland listeners still, or were in the old days. I remember Kenny McIntyre, not the junior one that does the football, but the old Kenny McIntyre, who was the absolute terrier, the news gatherer of Radio Scotland for many years. His father was known on Mull as the HIDB because he was the bank manager on Mull. And lots of people got loans on character-only references, which was common in lots of parts of Scotland. Now that's got nothing to do with stock exchange values and everything to do with community-focused ones. So, I mean, now that you've asked that question, I think we've all suddenly discovered we've got something to say, which is no.
I remember getting a loan from the local bank manager for a project which was, he just took on trust that I would be able to do the work and pay the money back and do the work and pay the money back little by little. It never came to anything because we weren't successful in buying the property in the first place. But he did okay the loan, which wouldn't happen now with centralised management of banks. We'll go to
ladies, you know, if we have to go to guys,
the lady there.
I think just in terms of the thing that what we really saw during the referendum was a completely different economic model of crowdfunding. And these are people all over the globe, all over the world. We didn't need a central person to lend with the expectation they would get that money back with a profit. They People give of themselves to nurture. We need seed money for businesses, not just loans that then will be taken back by somebody else. You know, we need to grow things, not just to have a tier of people who will make a profit off somebody else's creativity and hard work.
Thank you very much. David, I think you had your hand up, and then we'll go to Jean, then we'll go to
Can I
Callum.
move the subject a little bit?
Yeah.
Because my understanding is that in Nordic countries, that worker representation on company boards is statutory.
Yeah, some of them.
Is there some way we can, and with the carry on in INEOS recently, when it was going to get closed down, there was a battle between workers and the executives. If there'd been worker representation on that board, that would never have happened, in my opinion. So I was wondering how we can bring about a situation where we can have 50-50 representation on company boards.
This
this
relates to a continental model of management of firms where workers are represented equally with the staff, the salaried staff. That was
Well, just,
what you
just to say a wee bit, because I know everybody will have something to say on this. Funnily enough, there was a book that I co-edited, was just published yesterday, comparing Scotland and Norway in all sorts of respect, co-written by Scottish and Norwegian academics. It's the first of its kind in our history, I think, to really drill down right down to a lot of these details. It is cripplingly expensive. It costs 70 quid because it's an academic book. I have no idea why this has to happen, but if enough hardback copies are bought by those who can afford 70 quid for a book, it will come out as a paperback for something much more affordable. And you know, I am now going around trying to thrust leaflets into the hands of every civil servant saying, get your department to buy this book so the rest of the Scottish people can see what we've worked on for 2 years. But part of this, absolutely, is that what Willie was talking about as a sort of horizontal thing. You need to translate that into how it works. I was interviewing a guy, Kim Olsen, who runs the largest rubbish dump in Europe, in Sweden of course, because they are the arch recyclers, and Helsingborg. And I was on the edge of this big tip with, you know, an impressive array of all sorts of different recycling happening in this massive, massive sort of dump. And first of all he said, breathe in, and I sort of breathed in. He said, can you smell anything? And I said, no, I can't. He said, yes! He said, you know, that took us 3 years, and the way they measure it is that Henrik Larsson lives down the road, right? And they get Henrik Larsson to tell him if he's getting a smell. But the main thing, I was interviewing him anyway on the radio. It started to rain, and somewhere an umbrella just came over us by some very thoughtful person, so that we could just keep talking, albeit with the quite unaccountable sound of an umbrella pitter-pattering with rain. And at the end of it, I turned to thank this person, and I was introduced to the mayor of Helsingborg. She had put the umbrella over us. And in one moment, an awful lot of things went on in my head. When I went to interview a professor, we met in a canteen. This is one of the most eminent professors in ecology in Sweden, and he, like everybody else, cleared his plates from the canteen and put all the things back in the recycling bits of food there, bit of whatever there, knives there, forks there, plate there. It's hard to convey quite how normal this is, and then how much of a shock it is to come back here into upstairs, downstairs Scotland. So that what you've asked, and I often find this, that one piece of behaviour that interests people work in the Nordics because they're reinforced by all sorts of other level playing fields. I mean, you also trip over Swedish dads pushing prams around. So, you know, there's a level between the sexes as well of kind of horizontal behaviour. You know, it's interchangeability. And on top of all of that then, and possibly one of the determinants of it, is a social contract which has been in with the BRICS since the 1930s, when all these nations did the deals within their own states, which averted revolution. Because they were all waiting, well, not Finland, because they did have a very bloody civil war, but they were all waiting for that to sweep across all the Nordic states. And that probably, their proximity to Russia and then Finland, probably caused the Swedes and Norwegians to catch a grip and their bourgeois parties, however you want to describe it, their middle classes, did some pretty serious deals in terms of how to recompense workers. One of them was the place of workers on board. And you can go to Swedish things and wait, they're so punctual, it makes my life hell because I'm not. But I've been to things and been asked to wait for half an hour because the daily meeting with the union reps hasn't finished. So it's another world, and just to throw the final thought in, another thing which causes this sort of the horizontalness or the evenness or whatever you want to call it is proportional representation, which has been in since 1919 in nearly all of them. So they've had a century of compromise in every aspect of government, every level of it. So if you put all of that together, with extraordinary local power as well, and these are not local fiefdoms, which is what we often had in Scotland, that passed for local councils. If you put all of that together, you then have an easy kind of acceptance of the need to represent all the interests fairly within any enterprise, above all the ones that give your country work. And we're so far from that.
And the contrast, of course, is post-45 the same thing happened. There was an accommodation with the workers and labour to avert a revolution, but the British elite were much more powerful, smarter and entrenched. They'd just be finished running an empire. So they had the much stronger institutions to avert that. I mean, sure, after 45 things got more democratic for a while, but let's be honest, those people readjusted and have now managed to get that power and concentrate it back. And what Lesley said is, when I did a piece of work with Elsa Mackay looking at social security for Scotland as part of Communal, not just about welfare, about how to feel more secure in our work and stuff. And it's, the wage differentiation in this country. We have the lowest wages, looking at medium, the second lowest wages in the OECD after the States. And that's come about because of the British business model, which isn't very productive. You look at productivity figures this week, it isn't very productive, but it's hugely unequal. If you work in a shop here, you're made to work the till, and so that's really low paid work. If you work in a shop in Germany, for example, you'll be given responsibility for that area. You'll be given responsibility for stock within that area. You'll be given responsibility for the design and layout of it, and therefore you can pay people more for that. And that kind of horizontalism across business as well is crucial, and it's part of the reason that we have this low wage economy. And the low wage economy is hugely damaging in all sorts of ways. The welfare that's needed to pay poorly paid people, for example.
Jonathan, I think you wanted to say a
it's
couple
just
of
one
things.
sentence or two sentences. It's just the objective now of European capital is to roll back, not just in the UK but Europe-wide, is to roll back the post-1945 consensus. That is the objective of the European project in my view. I think you can see that in terms of the relationship we have with Greece, for example, where, to be honest, national democracies making a decision about austerity doesn't seem to mean much. And I think this is something we're going to have to think about. So, I'm in favour of looking at best practice on the continent, but I also think that we also have to have a critical eye here, because the process at work is frightening in terms of the pace. We're talking about in the UK losing the right to strike, quite seriously losing the right to strike. Len McCluskey wrote recently they're going to have to break laws in the not too distant future just to take strike action. So lots of things are getting taken away at a very fast pace at the same time as things are being privatised. And in the private sector, if you want to try and unionise in the private sector, very difficult. Only 6% of the private sector in the UK is unionised, and especially if you add into that 0 hours contracts and so on and so forth. That's what TTIP's all about. TTIP brings together all of that agenda. So I think that we have to mobilise Labour as an opposition to the project of European capital, which is to roll back all of the gains won since 1945.
Thanks, Jonathan. There was Jean, and then Callum, and then Jenny, and then Neil. Jean.
Yeah, there has been reference made to the way organisations treat people like cogs in a wheel, and the need for them to recognise the emotional needs of people. and there's also been a recognition that communities need to be able to tackle the problems that they face in communities. Communities face a great deal of problems from organisations who pay a non-living wage and use 0-hour contracts. This is totally, I think, harmful to communities, and could the panel suggest some ways that communities could help overcome those very negative things that, that very negative thing of people face?
How to roll back the sort of negative employment practices that are common.
I mean, I used to work for a trade union. If you look at all the information across Europe, where trade unions, the highest density of trade unions, the better wages are, the better conditions are, all these things. So some, organised labour is obviously the answer. People getting together and organising and standing up for the rights is part of the answer. But also, the trade unions became part of a structure and a system here. They became part. They became about hierarchy and power and big, guys strutting about thinking they're in The Sopranos. And so they've got to, I'm not saying it's their fault, but because there was much bigger forces against them, but they have to have a look at themselves and try and change that. I think it's the opportunity for us in this country is that the state is open to this. So if we create enough spaces and create the right legislative framework and stuff, and allow the trade unions to grow and organise again in a different way, I don't think they should look anything like they looked in the past. They need to be maybe based in communities and really democratic organisations for it to be there. I think that is part of the answer. Yeah, new types of trade union and labour organisation.
How can communities change that?
Well, everyone just needs to band together instead of all this separation. There's a real fear in workplaces to speak out and to take action. You actually don't even need to be a member of a union. All you need is people to agree in consensus. We're not going to turn up for work. And to overcome that huge fear. There is a massive fear in this country.
It's quite an impressive.
I don't think that's lightly done. I mean, if you look across any of the things where currently people are being exhorted to sort of just stand up on their own or even severally to something which is, as Jonathan has described it, a machine. Now, that's a kind of scary. That's scary, and actually, it's not even very wise. Because machines just go straight over you. Yeah. And also you'll find in that last moment there will be some folk who are still out there in the front and the rest have all disappeared. So it's not great for solidarity either, and it's very important to keep solidarity high and not to do things which kind of will inevitably weaken it. And that's where, just coming back to your point, it just strikes me that at the moment it's very difficult for a community to do anything in Scotland. I mean, what you have to do to fix things that are wrong in Scotland is to be a hero. What you do to fix things in right-sized democracies like any of those we've mentioned is to vote. That's the reason that they have high turnouts. But here you need to do like any of the folk I've written about or about, whether it's West Whittlowburn, Egg, the John Chapel Men's Health Group, all these people who have gone in and just thrown themselves at a problem. It's taken them 10 years. It's wrecked their relationships. It's wrecked their health. So the difficulty to me is, it's great that communities will put this extra effort in, but everywhere else it's extra effort. Here it's the only thing there is at community level, because we don't have structures, we don't have any kind of backbone, we don't have any support in at that community level. Now I hear that you say there's community councillors here, and I don't mean to be kind of rude again about any individuals, but community councils are both in structural terms. They were created to be both, right? Because they were created to make sure that nobody made the mistake after local reorganisation in 1974 of thinking that their town council still existed. So they had to look nothing like it. The average budget, I'm sick of saying it, perhaps you're sick of hearing it, perhaps you haven't, is £400 a year. which has to be spent on stationery. You're having a laugh. And a recent survey which looked at various forms of local, by which I mean genuinely community local democracy, looked at the English system. Now, the English have town and parish councils, which have an average budget of £750,000, funded by a precept on the rates. It's all quite organised. Now, that system, the English one, was found to be the weakest of every local, genuinely community democracy in Europe. The English one with £750,000, £400. So the thing is, I now would not urge, I'm afraid, anybody to spend their time working to make a community council function, because it can't happen, except under extraordinary circumstances, which can be taken away by the next administration of the next council. You know, enough already with the palliatives. And I'll tell you something else. This situation will not be fixed by the so-called Community Empowerment Bill, because it's not brave enough to tackle community councils. It neither knocks them on the head and puts them out of their misery, nor stands them up and gives them budget control and power. So there's lots of, exactly what you're saying, will occur in every subject you could care to mention, whether it's protecting people with wages, whether it's trying to get local energy companies together, all the things you might expect to be able to think of doing in other countries, our neighbours, cannot happen here, because the tent pegs are going into sand. Yeah.
That's a pretty bold statement. Just like 2 minutes. Just
Can I ask Jonathan to come in?
I'm going to go for my training in like 30 seconds, right? I just wanted to make one point, because I just want to say this, because I think it is relatively important, because it's about communities and resistance. Okay, I think it's about strategy and tactics. What the Tories have done is essentially they've devolved the axe. We've all heard this phrase, yeah? So what they've done is, instead of appearing to cut services at a national level, they've devolved it. And what they've also done is they've devolved and fragmented resistance to those cuts as well. And therefore, the two moments of most important moments of rupture when it comes to austerity are the student movement, which took place, which was a huge rebellion, which was very significant, and the independence referendum. Why? Because in both these issues, we were able to resist, to mobilise, to discuss the issue at a national level. In other words, we, in both these circumstances, had a national agenda. And this is what we have to think about when it comes to austerity, 0 hours contracts and all that sort of thing. We also, as well as having to be active in our own communities, we need national movements. We need national mobilisations to actually confront the centralism of the Tories of Westminster and so on. And I think that's an important thing, because often we automatically assume that the best resistance is local resistance. It's not always the case. You need the local base, you need the local mobilisation, but you also need to have the national agenda. You need to have the, I don't mean to put it in these terms, but you need to have the square go with the government over the issue. That's how you get stuff done. That's what they're doing in Ireland just now about water.
Yeah.
You know, they're not having a protest of 200 people in each community or whatever. They're having big mobilisations, big rallies and all that sort of thing. They're saying, no, it's our water. You know, and I think they're going to win because of that. Anyway, I spoke too much. Yeah.
David, do you want to come back on that?
Sorry. Lesley, I'm afraid you don't know the local geography around here the way I do. There is an area committee. So we devolved from the centre, from the big 5 council thing, to 7 area committees. So there's an area committee at Dunfermline. That area committee funds local community councils far more than your £400. One of my community councils in Town Hill, I'll take it out and I'll show you what they're about. They spent £17,000 last year because they were able to come up with projects that were beneficial to their community and were generated by that community. I, as a local councillor, had very little to do with what they were doing, but because there was the initiative and the expertise and the capacity within that community council, they were able to generate the ideas and then generate the money. I've created in my ward 3 other community councils, and I've got 5 community councils across my ward, and they're all working hard. One of them is an expert on planning. So anybody in my ward that wants to know about the NIMBYs that are happening across here can go to one of the community councils and get fantastic expertise from them. That's a resource that wasn't there if we wouldn't have a community council. So community councils can be very powerful. If they're controlled by the Labour Party, which they were in the past, I agree with you, useless. If they're controlled by the local population, they can be very, very effective.
I think that kind of depends upon having a good local councillor who's willing to do that. You know, and in some ways it's like you're giving them back that power. Really. And I know, because I was some of the good community councils in Dunfermline I went as well. And I would much rather have been a councillor for Milesmark than for the whole of Dunfermline, because it would have been a lot more manageable, and I would have done it for nothing, and I would have had time to do it. So I think the problem is the scale, as Lesley was on about. Devolving power down from Glenrothes to Milesmark or Town Hill or something is not really the way. It should be Town Hill and Milesmark and the centre of Dunfermline deciding where they give power and pulling power and giving it up to the centre of Dunfermline or the Glenrothes. So I think that's the issue really.
Yeah.
It's about who's got the power and are they giving it, is it in the local communities and they're pulling it together, or is it's concentrated somewhere remote and being granted to them.
That's an aspiration, I agree.
Can I say a wee thing on this?
Say that Jonathan has to go to get his train. Can you give him a Lesley?
Yeah. First of all, I did point out that 400 was the average. Secondly, 17,000 is nothing. And I'm not trying to belittle your efforts, David. This is what gores me great, is to see people putting enormous efforts into a structure which can never do much more than these relatively small things. In terms of, if you were in any other country, you would actually have a council that was raising its own taxes in Dunfermline, not a community council, a community council that got 17,000 quid. You would have access to far more decision making. And I know this sounds sort of counterintuitive, because I'm somebody who's been so involved, not in political parties, but in community stuff. But actually, I'm now beginning to think that it just encourages a really rubbish structure to keep existing, that we breathe life all the time, our life, into structures which are one step forward, 4 steps back. I mean, you can cite examples here. You can hear examples. Grangemouth Community Council dissolved themselves when they were completely ignored in their mapping for what they wanted around Grangemouth. There was nothing more they could do to say how profoundly they felt completely ignored. There's structures, there's people trying to do stuff within the current structure all over Scotland. And do you know that's what we specialise at? We specialise at trying to make broken things work.
Yeah.
We specialise at the application of sticking plaster. And that's why we take all our examples from other sticking plaster societies like America, whose average performance is shocking, but whose ability to apply a couple of sticking plasters to it is probably pretty good actually. Now, sometime we've got to decide what kind of society we want. Do we want to keep retrofitting the mistakes we never tried to solve? Or do we want to say, let's get it right first time? Just for once in our lives, let's create structures that are likely to not need fiddling with afterwards.
I agree.
Good.
Callum and then
How do
Jenny
we
and
do
then
that? Can I ask, how the hell do we do it? How do we actually get there? What mechanism do we use? We're all, a lot of us here are members of SNP, do we lobby SNP? How do we actually create the environment you describe?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. I mean, those of you who are in the SNP, a lot rests on your shoulders now. Because, I know this spring conference is not going, it's just a great, it's a big sort of, validation of the leadership sort of exercise, this conference. But the next conference, I think a lot of people will be looking to what you produce. And Jonathan has been talking about, the Left Alliance that he's, I haven't quite got that off my tongue yet, Scottish Left Project, that would that would be gathering, I think irrespective of actually where the SNP goes, because I think he makes the fair point that if the Labour Party collapses, something has to occupy that space. But if somebody within the SNP doesn't start trying to tackle decentralising power in Scotland, then another party will have to do it. And there is not one currently, although the Greens arguably are into some of that, but something might have to be done explicitly. The other thing to say, though, the cheerier thing to say, is that there's already people who are, to quote the Peter Finch character in Network, my favourite film, mad as hell and don't give a damn anymore. And those are the people of South Carroll, who are so hacked off after the Castle Tower nonsense that happened there. And if any of you don't know what happened, in summary, a beautiful old building that was derelict was going to be bought by the community. They went through all the hoops for the community buyout mechanisms. It took some of them 18 months of their life where they did nothing else. They managed to get £750,000 from the Community Land Fund. It was all looking tickety-boo. They had a business plan. They had people planning to come in to occupy some of the empty spaces. It was great. I launched the community consultation thingy. They managed to get the requisite 60% of the population in the place to turn out and vote, la-di-da-di-da. And at the last minute, Argyll and Bute Council doubled the asking price. And then said it would lend this development company £1 million, and when they couldn't repay it, because there was no way they'd ever be able to repay it, they'd already seen the business plan, it was impossible, they could declare themselves bankrupt and give the asset back to the council again. And the meeting at which that happened was held in Lochgilphead, despite everyone appealing for it to be held in Dunoon, because that's where it all affected them, a 3-hour round trip away, so none of them could attend. So those guys are not just angry, but now getting even, because they're going to be holding an event on the 6th of June, which will be trying to create a template for a People's Council. So they're going to have experts from all over the place. They're going to look at different systems, and if nobody else is going to do it, if the political parties aren't going to do it, then they're going to start themselves. And as one of the lassies said to me, she said, we're not the experts. We know there's other folk around Scotland who are probably more expert and more interested. We're more angry. Yeah. And so they're prepared to go over the top and organise this. And soon that information will be around, because every meeting I'm going to, someone like yourself asks just that question. And I try to collect 1 or 2 emails and feed them into the South Carroll folk. The meeting will be in Oban on the 6th of June. So I think that's a honey of a way forward, because it's actually people focused, and it's folk who've gone through it the hard way, who are not just going off in a huff and getting, annoyed. They're taking that energy and they're trying to find a new system for Scotland, and if nobody's interested at the end of that, we'll be in the same situation as the Icelanders when they did their crowdsourced constitution, when the politicians just ignored that. So I think that's a pretty good way forward, and if you want to give me an email or whatever, I'll feed that one into it to make sure that you're connected.
Yeah, just picking up on that. I mean, I think part of this comes back to something we were talking about earlier about the fact that democracy is broken. The people that are meant to represent us don't. Power is meant to rest with us, and we give it to these people to do stuff on our behalf, and they don't. We need to be able to find a way, such as the initiative that Lesley's talking about, where we say to our local representatives, your authority is now illegitimate. We are not here to put sticking plasters on your mess. We're going to get rid of you. We're going to put something else in place that's going to represent our interests.
I can't speak for Rick, but our Commonweal doesn't have any plans to stand candidates. I mean, what we do want to do is I say, write a set of policies in quite an accessible format that will be asking people to challenge the representatives to meet and to decide on who they're going to vote for on the grounds there. I think there's, for me, there's it's just like this discussion that's went on. Representative democracy is important, and political parties are important, but there's something not right about them now. I think setting up another political party has problems, and if we're saying that these people aren't fully able to represent us at this time, so what's until we can find out what's wrong with that. And still, I think what Common Weal would aspire to be, to describe these institutions of the past being hierarchical, central and stuff, and not really relevant to the way that we live our lives now. We need to find new types of institutions. So Common Weal might aspire to find a way what is. I don't know what they look like now, but I think that's part of the search. And I think this idea that we have a roadmap and we know what the future is going to be like and what the institutions of the future look like is wrong. It's not the way things work anymore. I think we've got to sit down, talk about it, think about it, create spaces like this again and again, revisiting what it might look like, and then build it. So I don't know what it looks like at the moment. Hopefully, in months or years' time, we will. I think it might look more like Podemos, the Spanish party that was set up by local circles, who put the idea of power on the table right away and said, look, anybody, even a saint, who gets too much power will use it for their own interests or people round about them. That's just human nature, that's what human beings are like. And that's what happens in the current political party. So we would be reluctant to move into a political structure that means that it's recreating an old elite at the moment. So until I can find a different way to do that, which I think is more based in community politics and community ways of organising, then we don't know.
But can the current politicians that are in the Scottish Parliament, the policies of Common Weal, and that you're right, can they just, because you don't really have any power,
that's always about power.
Can they not just brush you aside and ignore the policies that you write and that you propose?
Sure, they can to an extent at the moment. I think that's why we need, and we've got a political strategy that is building political support for these positions and is building, building people who say this is what we want. It's always about power, and as long as we assume that they have the power and we don't, then they'll let us continue to think that. But if we understand and realise that actually we have the power, they need our votes. Not only do they need our votes, they need our cooperation, they need our taxes, they need all of these things, and we're going to ask for something different, then I think that's when transformation will come about. But I think we now have the most sophisticated electorate in the world, probably in Scotland, because of the referendum campaign. The interesting thing is now we know how they do politics. The greatest power is the power to make meaning. The way that you tell people what's important, the way that you tell them what it means for them. And we saw during the referendum, the banks, the supermarkets and that, and political parties uniting. We all understand how they do it. We all understand how they manipulate us, manipulate the media, manipulate our feelings. That is hugely encouraging because they can't get away with it again. We know how it works. So I think the opportunity is there for us to push for a different type of politics.
Could I just answer? Not really for myself, but simply having been present, like other women in this room, at the Women for Independence conference in Perth, which passed a resolution to consider setting up a women's party in September. And the reason for that is not just representation of women, but the inability to get issues like carers, proper funding for carers, and just very tangible issues right to the top of the political agenda, so that we're not.
Lesley, I was the lady that spoke about caring
Right.
at the time.
Yeah.
And what I was saying is that I've made talks in public to groups of carers, but what I did at the Women for Independence was to speak to the general public, and that was a completely different arena. And I was then, like I am now, my heart's pounding, because I'm trying to get across the point that we talked earlier on about an average wage being less, or 23,000. That would take me 7 years to earn that as a carer. And my working week is 133 hours long. I look after my 20-year-old son who has profound and multiple disabilities, complex care needs, registered blind, epileptic, doubling continent, wheelchair user, and he's a legend. That was one thing I didn't get to say, he's a legend. I love the going Zoom. This is his big sister here, bringing her along to sort of baptise her a bit of politics. I have felt for 20 years completely and utterly disempowered because caring isn't a sexy topic. It gets rolled out once a year so that they can polish your halo and then put you back in the box, portray you as a saint. And it's not like that. I would be very interested in the idea of the citizen's income so that I am remunerated for my labour. I can contribute to my community by buying goods and services and have worth in my own right rather than being, not that I'm made to feel like that, but chattel of my husband who is the only breadwinner in the house. And 750,000 Scottish carers, 29,000 young carers, and it's only going to get larger as our population ages. And I think it's absolutely heinous in this day and age that my best wish at the minute is to earn the same as a job seeker.
Well, the point is, I'm only observing what you said, is that there are certainly within Women for Indy, there is a desire to put that experience right at the top. And all that politics is about is shuffling the cards. Which ones are the priorities? Because you don't get that many chances to actually have a priority. And for all the women present, your contribution was the most important thing that day, me included. So, there's one beginning. Jonathan has just said that the Scottish Left Project is thinking of fielding candidates in 2016 to try to give an alter, to try to build on what he imagines might by then be the ashes of the Labour Party. And he made, I think, the very reasonable point that we need opposition. And a tremendously good point as well, that actually echoes the experience of the Nordics. Sorry, I will stop kind of trolling about them all the time, but it's just they've been through some of this. There was no separate nationalist party or independence party created by the Norwegians or the Icelanders to create independence. All their normal parties just moved towards that as a logical conclusion, including the Tories in Norway. It was them joining the fray in 1905 which contributed to independence. The Norwegians had a bigger argument about which language to use than whether to become independent eventually. So there's an interesting model that he's talking about, and I do think that there will come a time where it's not possible to keep trying to influence people who aren't listening. And I'm sorry, but at the moment the SNP are not listening to this demand for local empowerment.
Jenny, and then we've got Neil, and then we've got Marie. Jenny.
I'm going to say something to you that I don't think will necessarily be at all popular. And the reason it won't be popular is because, as most of you, I would reckon, are well-educated and intelligent people. And we've talked quite a lot about the inequality, the lack of equality in society, and the lack of a level playing field. And if Commonweal means anything, it means inclusion. And at the heart of that inclusion, there should be our children. And my background is in education. I've taught for 35 years children 8, 7, 6, 5, 4 and 3. And I've taught in prosperous areas and I've taught in very poor areas. And if there's one thing that I'm sure about, it is that we definitely fail at least 20% of our children. And one of the reasons that we don't talk about it very much is because we don't fail the middle classes. It's the people who have very little to start with that we fail. And over these few weeks when I've been going round doors and I've been canvassing and talking to people, as a teacher I have felt ashamed at the standard of education that I've found from the people that I've been speaking to. Not the common humanity, not the lack of ideas, but just the lack of ability to have the education that holds them up and enables them to take a really good place in society. And one of the reasons that I think that this happens is for our iniquitous system of starting formal education for children aged between 4.5 and 5.5. That does not suit the youngest and it doesn't suit the poorest. And yet, every time I mention this to a middle-class parent, they say, oh, but you see, my child started at 4.5, but you see, they were really terribly clever and we would have been so bored. Well, what happens in Scandinavia to all these bored children? You don't hear that the Scandinavians are somehow or other lacking in the education stakes. In fact, if anything, they're doing far better than us. And the stretch in society that is created by this is just, it's not there to the same extent. Now, I think for any government this is a hot potato. Because all these middle class voters are going to say, no, this is the way we've always done it. Well, I would just urge us to start to look outside the box, because it's a lot as though for education we're inside that mirror-lined box, looking at ourselves and nodding and saying, but we've always done this, it worked fine for me, it works fine, it doesn't work fine for everyone. So you are the sort of people that I think should be at least talking about it, because at the moment it just sits there. And we've talked a bit about sticking plaster. And sticking plaster, you know, is loads of remedial teachers. It's looking yet again about how we teach reading, all of that. We don't need to do any of that. But we need to think about the age at which we expect these children to be able to put their feet on the first rung of the ladder. Because a lot of them never make it. And really, from the beginning, they're failing. And it's not their fault, it's ours. Yeah.
Until you have transformational childcare, it doesn't matter what you have for education. Unless you have a system that supports the parents who are pulling their hair out at 4.5 because they're exhausted and they're so sick of being poor and not being able to make a wage and everything else. It's not just the education system. We need a fundamental layer of childcare so before that time happens, and that will help take a lot of the load off of that 20% that's not making on the first rung. Got to start somewhere.
It's not just the childcare system either. I think this is something that we've got to kind of get away from in politics, is kind of putting things into these kind of unconnected policy boxes, It's to do with work, it's to do with the nature of work, it's to do with how long people spend at work, it's to do with housing, it's to do with the quality of housing, the type of housing they have, it's to do with alienation. If you're brought up in a house where your parents are alcoholics or drug users, it doesn't matter what time you start school, you're not particularly open to it. I agree with you that you should start school later, but there's something bigger need to transform. We need to make sure that people have got decent housing, we need to make sure that they've got meaningful things to do, that they feel safe and secure, and they've got a citizen's income, a big policy that we've done. I'm working quite closely now with some academic economists on modelling how we can, we can pay for a citizen's income, how we can gradually introduce it, and so that it can stand up to the attacks that we'll get when we finally come forward and say that a citizen's income is, it's the kind of only way that we're going to transform work and give people time to really take part in democracy as well.
But
so let's connect it all.
The only thing with that is that it's great to get a citizen's income so that your personal pocket allows you to buy your way into or for whatever services you want. But you can't create a childcare system like that. I mean, the Irish are the great example of this. In the crazy days where they were the Celtic Tiger, There was enough readies to be able to buy anything you want. 2 of them, 3 of them. But could you get decent roads? No. Could you get a decent health service? No. You can't individually buy that. And I think the thing, you're so right, Jenny, and your American lass at the back, or if you're Canadian, I'm sorry that I didn't think of it. But, you know, we have to think now that childcare is absolutely, that period of birth to 3 is crucial in constructing the citizen, or the person who's got a chance in life. And actually all the evidence points to this now, that, you know, 70% of language is in or not in by the age of 3, the ability, the soft skills and all the rest of it. And what seems to be absolutely key is engaged play. Now, weirdly, the people who come top of the UNICEF Child Wellbeing Index quite frequently are Denmark and Cyprus. Very different societies. But Cyprus still has large families, maybe 4 or 6 wains, both the adults living at home, maybe all the grandparents in the same house, 6 donkeys. I mean, it's an active place to be, because most of the production is happening at home, and that seems to give quite engaged play in the traditional way. Denmark has tremendous childcare, because they have noticed what we don't seem to have noticed. We're not having 6 children anymore. We're having 1.4. And the 1.4 is having a tough time in all households, rich and poor, in getting engaged play. The trouble is, for the poor, as you rightly say, it's an absolute death sentence in terms of their progress through society. So that's where the smart countries have tried to create an ability to have engaged play from birth to 3. And in Norway, they're doing it with outdoor kindergartens. So we also get away from this incredible troglodyte behaviour we have in Scotland, where despite having probably the best scenery in the world outside the door, we spend all our time inside, as if outside is full of threat. And again, if you put all of that together, you end up completely squashing children, when actually this period could be the most fruitful way to help the next generation. So a citizen's income is fine.
I think you
but
misunderstood
it needs,
what I was
I know, and I'm not really arguing against it, but I'm saying you're so right to put that policy up in its own right, because it keeps getting taken down again, you know. But this one needs to get put right up there, and very often if I'm asked for my top policy things, it's actually that. Because that would be the thing that would start change right now, the second that that's put in for the next generation of kids. So we're not retrofitting skills onto broken teenagers anymore, which is what we are doing now.
I apologise, I will go back a little bit to the community councils. I think the point that I wanted to make, and I've got a question after this which is completely separate, but the point I wanted to make earlier was really that after the referendum, and we didn't get the blank sheet of paper that I think we all wanted to build a local democracy, the kind of vision that you have, and that vantage point that you bring from the Nordic countries is really valuable. But what we certainly tried to do here, we tried to think of what can we work with now? What exists that we can get into and start pushing to make things better? And it's not perfect, and it's absolutely far from ideal. And David put a motion through our local area committee to try and get more money from community councils, not to be gifted piecemeal every time they come up with a good idea to come cap in hand, but to give them real money so that they could come up with their own projects and take it into their community and start to develop participative democracy in a real meaningful way. It's not big bucks, but at least it gives the model some form and structure, and it gives the people in this room who've taken up that mantle and that challenge, it gives them some ownership and a presence in the community, and that has been fantastic. It's not perfect, but it's a real start. And we will, in our lofty positions with real money, and it's ridiculous because we will keep pushing for decentralisation, but actually what decentralisation we're getting today, I had the displeasure of sitting through an executive committee at Fife Council where they decentralised a budget that was inadequate, and what they've actually done is they've amalgamated our budgets at area committee with an inadequate budget for non-domestic rate reductions So we're now going to have to pull it out of other money. So that it's not decentralisation. It follows the model that you spoke about in Westminster's devolving the responsibility to cut. And it's very frustrating, but we've got to keep going. We've got to try, and I'm interested in challenging in any way that we can, but we've got to use the tools that are there at the moment. And it is really important that people who are in community councils are empowered and encouraged, and because they will become those local councillors when we do eventually get our blank sheet of paper to say, right, we're going to do it this way. But they've got to get their feet wet in this dysfunctional, broken system.
No. No, because what people learn is second best. What people learn is littleness. What people learn is to persevere with brokenness. And do you know what they're better doing their time with? I think, this is just my own personal opinion, is to join a development trust. Because then you could actually end up with fairly big bucks. They're not democratic either, because they're not properly elected. But as long as we purple along with this, I know where I would spend my time. I would spend my time on something like buying egg. I would spend my time on some big proposition that actually totally changes things, is a game changer. And I'm sorry, but I wouldn't spend my time keeping going a structure which is there at the largesse of the council. I'm delighted Fife, after Alex Rowley, took some initiatives. But you know, you only need a change of administration. It's gone like that.
Well, hopefully the change of administration will do exactly what we're talking about, but it's an SNP.
Have you got a question?
Can I ask you something? Can I ask you, where is the evidence? Because I'd love to see it. Where is the evidence the SNP are pushing for this as a structural change?
Well, I'm talking about local, what the local.
I know, but your tail end was that if there was a change of administration, the SNP would change things. I'm waiting to be happy.
I think. Well, I would push for that. I mean, all I can talk about is what I would want to seek, what we are seeking locally.
Aye, but what I'm saying is, it's not just Fife. You know, we need to get this policy change to the SNP conference.
Yeah.
And you guys can either put your energies into. I've had this so often, young folk coming up to me and saying, you know, I'm going to get involved in my community council. I'm sorry, part of me weeps.
Think globally, act locally.
Yes, but we haven't got local. We haven't got power at the local set.
I think
Do you know,
there's always a...
if the people of Egg had spent their time peopling a community council, they wouldn't have created a buyout, and they wouldn't have changed the law because the Land Reform Act wouldn't have been passed, because they changed things. When I think you've got to match your energy, the time that you live in, the structures, the possibilities, and place it as well as a triple, whatever it is, darts thing, right into the bullseye, so you spend the best possible use of your time. And I wouldn't put young people into something which will teach them that to a great degree, paper shuffling and expecting £17,000 to be a Herculean amount of money for communities to deal with is normal. Never learn that.
Do you know, and what Lesley just described there is, what Lesley just described there is why I was reluctant about political parties, because that's kind of how I feel a little bit about political parties. But this is an interesting tension between, you know, the old structures and institutions who, you know, let's be honest, haven't dealt with inequality, haven't dealt with, you know, the lack of power in communities, haven't dealt with Dunfermline Town Centre, which is, you know, a bit of a depression for me to come back here and walk down it, to be honest with you, and hasn't dealt with climate change. So, you know, these old institutions haven't really done it, you know, and so the challenge is, do they change, can we change them into something new and different and transformative, or do we have to create, and this is what Lesley's perhaps suggesting, do we have to create something completely new outside of that? I'm not really sure, you know, because actually the old institutions aren't going to go away, you know. There's still going to be councillors, there's still people getting paid quite a lot of money to be council officials who are paying their mortgages and stuff and looking after their kids. So the trick is, how do we make that transformation from these old and disempowering institutions into something that is both empowering, but is also going to challenge, you know, take on these big challenges and solve them, you know. It's a conversation we've got to have.
Just something to clarify in case I've made it misunderstood anybody. I'm not suggesting another parallel universe with the People's Council idea. The Oban folk are putting forward a template to change Scottish local government.
Yeah, that's all right.
They're not putting up a parallel universe. They're suggesting something which they will take right the way through to then try to say to the Scottish Government, this is what we have worked through as punters. So it's not with the aim of setting up parallel things, it's with the aim of revolutionary change to our local government system from the grassroots.
That is wonderful.
Was there a question?
Yes, the question,
Right.
different tangent, but the question is really, and it's been hinted earlier, but it's really about the new left down south, and then plus will he start a new party, and what links exist with Commonweal and RIC, with those kind of groups down south, and how can we synergise that effort? Because I know we get, on the media, we're constantly told that us jocks are getting, really lippy and belligerent, having the temerity to send down our MPs to start up a bit of a storm. But the reality is, that there's a lot of people down south who are excited by this, who would like to have a bit of this. And it's about how do we utilise that synergy, how do we make really meaningful and helpful links down south that we're not characterised as chicken jocks, but we're actually seen as democratic leaders and how to do politics differently. Have you any thoughts on how we can use that to our mutual advantage?
Can I say something on that? I think the Lennon Cluster factor, I think we've seen too often in the past where there's been a big figurehead thinking he's got a new idea, going to have a brand new party, and it all revolves around the personality of this one individual. What it with Arthur Scargill when he set up his alternative party? They don't work. It's another hierarchical structure. And what's been coming right through the discussion here tonight is about how we're down at where it needs to be with us. And I think any alternative party has to start from the grassroots upwards. There are interesting things happening down south with the People's Assembly, but that is going at from the grassroots level and not relying on the celebrity leader. I think anything that goes down there will be doomed to failure.
To say, you're right. I'm on. As one of the founder members of an organisation called Compass, which actually wasn't outside the Labour Party and then left the Labour Party and has connections with SNP, the Plaid, Greens, Social Liberals, people from no party as well. And for years, our analysis was that we needed a social movement, like happened in Scotland, And all those people are about that, people like John Harrison, Neil Lawson, who's the chair of Compass, John Curtis, who's in the Labour Party. They're enthralled by what's happened in Scotland. It's something they prayed for years and didn't know how to make it happen. So I think they're dying to learn from us, and they're dying to see this be a success, So I think we've got. Scotland's not only got a responsibility for itself. I think it's got, because I said these changes are happening all over Europe. The breakdown of hierarchy, distrust in elites, climate change, inequality growing. Even in the Nordic countries, inequality is growing. These are global forces. They've managed it a lot better than we have. We're probably one of the worst people at managing, but it's happening. So there needs to be a different way. These are new times, and they need new ways. We're not going to dictate to people anymore, as we have in the past, how to do it. What we hope to do is create spaces and give them tools to allow them to do it.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question. So Marie, you're next.
Hiya. Just a quick question. 78% of the candidates standing at Westminster are men. How different a country would this be with 50-50 gender balance in Parliament?
It's a nice wee question at the end, Emery. Well, I think it would be extraordinarily different. I wrote a column about this for the Scotsman on Monday, and I never read the comments because I like my sanity, but I was particularly advised not to look this week, and I see on Twitter there's been a big sort of stooshy with Wings or Scotland weighing in. I'm getting extremely excited about the whole thing on a sort of anti kind of women's only shortlist style thing. I just think that the belief that natural problems will naturally unravel themselves, and that entitlement, which to me is the absolute kind of enemy of all equality and progress and blossoming and hope. Entitlement. That's the #1 problem in our country. And it actually runs through lots of the contributions tonight, because entitlement is not just the preserve of unionists, it's not just the preserve of men, it's not just the preserve of capitalism. Trade unionists had shown just exactly some of the same, as you were saying, Roy, had shown just the same sort of feelings of entitlement. There's a pecking order in life, and actually we're all very alert to where we are in it. And that's why I often intervene to say, let's just change the way that we take even questions in an audience. Because once somebody intervenes and sets up a different template, by gum, did we not manage tonight? We had tremendous contributions, probably the most memorable ones, and I'm not trying to be funny guys, from the 2 women here, right? And this happens as soon as somebody intervenes and says, normal is not that the people who feel most able to speak, speak. And perhaps that's because I'm an old hippie lefty that went through the whole non-violent direct action stuff in the 70s, but we learnt how to facilitate meetings, not to sort of just run them like, you know, just let the loudest voices talk most. And I appreciate I am completely contradicting all of that by whining on at the front. But this to me is a microcosm, the difficulty of if you just allow the natural outcome of a meeting, we wouldn't have, I think, have heard from those 2 women. And this happens day in, day out, everywhere. Now that's not just women, it's the young folk. There's a young chela in here who wants to speak to me after the meeting. I'm not sure, where are you? Put your come on, you're there. Put your hand up somewhere. Are you still here? Well, you know, that's a shame, because I could see he also had to get his courage to come up and speak to me. But if you make an effort to think, how do we facilitate everybody in this room so that you could try to see when people come in, or if there's someone younger, bring them in at that relevant moment. Now that's just a meeting. Then let's take society, right, or even candidates for election. I think we need to start facilitating how that is chosen. And I've spoken to lots of women dandering around the place who've said, actually, I went to some of the selection committee meetings for SNP candidates in particular, and I didn't say anything, I didn't ask a question because I was so nervous, I didn't want to ask a question. So the mere presence of women in a lot of these meetings is not enough. There has to be a way of running it that expects equal contribution. And it's funny, because whatever you expect, you create. And I've found that throughout my life. If I think, which I do, that every crowd I've ever come into contact with, no matter how dodgy the situation in Radio Scotland, that in that crowd was a genius, was a funny person, was someone who would say something more profound than I could ever have expected to happen that day. And my job was easy, I just had to find them. And that's the approach I took with everything. And funnily enough, on nearly every occasion, I found a genius. I found someone who was funny. It depends on your outlook. And I think the outlook we've had is that IBEAN and the sort of people who put themselves forward for representation are going to be the kind of people who will do it again. And we have to break this, because this entitlement at all levels is the thing that is actually stultifying our society and switching young people off to all of this, because they know we'll just grab the goodies.
Can I just say that? I can just expand a bit on what we've been doing at Commonweal Fight meetings in Kirkcaldy. One of as I said, I think when I was talking earlier, we weren't sure who was going to come, what the background would be, how confident they would be to contribute, whether there was going to be loud voices or people that were a bit shy about sort of coming forward. So we, rather than having the big crowd, we deliberately, right at the start, we broke people up into groups by the tables that were actually in the room. And whether it was that or just the nature of the people that came, I don't know, but we found it worked really well because everybody got engaged, everybody took part in all the discussions and didn't feel they were sitting back to let louder voices speak. And I think that the rest of the folk here will agree that we found that worked really, really well in terms of working out what people are wanting to talk about, what the issues are that concern them, and it will form the basis of how we do stuff in the future.
Can I just say something about leadership? in answer to this question. You know, there's a way of describing the type of leaders that we've had in the past, and they're kind of heroic. I call them heroic leaders, and that's not a compliment, really. You know, they're single-minded, determined, not listening to other people, you know, power-driven, arrogant, mainly men, you know, and those types of leadership aren't enough anymore. They don't work anymore. If you think about what we think is a good leader in politics, then that's what they're like. But actually, what we need now, if we're talking about, you know, things only get done through collaboration, and one group, as we found out here, one group's not going to be enough. There needs to be networks. People need to be connected together. So the leaders of the future have got to be people that can facilitate. They've got to have empathy. They've got to, you know, promote people from around them, you know, and encourage them. And those traits are much more, you know, ones that women have at the moment. I'm not saying that men can't have them or learn them, but you know, we're socialised to an extent. So I think there's a great opportunity that we should be bringing forward more women leaders, so that all of us can learn to lead in a new way, because that's the only way we're going to solve the big problems that are ahead of us.
And there's one thing sure, the public boarding school system is not going to bring about this increased amount of empathy.
Yeah.
It's time, that was the time for the last question, that was, and we're running up to 5 to 10, so I'd like to thank Willie and Grant and Lesley and Jonathan, who was here on your behalf, for all their contributions, for all their time and their effort and their enthusiasm, and they've certainly given us a whole lot to think about. Can I ask you to show you? Did you sell some of your books?
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed that there's people wanting a wee one. There's one wee one left here for any. There's fun folk who wanted to get it. So if you want
The bar stays open a bit later than this, I understand.